The Sheriff's Wager by Weston Ford. Clara Whitmore pressed her palm against the cool glass of the train window, watching the vast expanse of Texas roll past in shades of ochre and sage. The locomotive's rhythmic clatter had become a lullaby over the past 3 days, but now it only served to remind her of how far she'd traveled from everything familiar. Boston felt like another lifetime, though it had been merely a week since she'd boarded this iron beast bound for Cedar Ridge. Final stop, Cedar Ridge, the conductor called, his voice cutting through her reverie. Clara smoothed her traveling dress, a practical gray wool that had seemed appropriate for her new life as a schoolteacher. Her reflection in the window showed a woman of 23 with auburn hair pinned severely back and green eyes that betrayed more determination than fear, though both emotions warred within her chest. The train shuddered to a halt with a great hiss of steam, and Clara gathered her carpetbag and small trunk. She'd sold everything else before leaving Boston, including her mother's china and her father's books. The decision had been necessary but painful, much like leaving behind her engagement to Edmund Hartwell, a man chosen more by her late parents' wishes than her own inclinations. Cedar Ridge's station was little more than a wooden platform and a small building that looked as though a strong wind might topple it. Clara stepped down from the train car, her boots clicking against weathered planks, and immediately understood why her gloves had seemed unnecessary. The Texas heat enveloped her like a blanket, despite the late October date. "Miss Whitmore." She turned to find a tall man approaching, his badge catching the afternoon light. Sheriff's badge, she realized, noting the star pinned to his vest. He was perhaps 30 years of age, with dark hair that needed cutting and brown eyes the color of coffee. His face was weathered in a way that spoke of long hours under the relentless sun, but his smile was gentle. "Sheriff Jake Morrison," he said, removing his hat. "Mrs. Henderson asked me to collect you. She's preparing supper and didn't want to leave her kitchen unattended." Clara studied him carefully. In Boston, she'd learned to read men's intentions quickly, a skill that had served her well in navigating society's expectations. This man's gaze was direct but respectful, and his posture suggested competence rather than arrogance. "I appreciate the courtesy, Sheriff Morrison. I confess I'm rather overwhelmed by the journey." "First time west." He reached for her trunk without being asked, lifting it as though it weighed nothing. "Indeed. I've lived my entire life in Boston." She fell into step beside him as they walked toward a wagon hitched to 2 sturdy horses. "Boston's a fine city, I'm told. What brings a Boston lady to teach school in Cedar Ridge?" The question she'd been dreading. Clara had rehearsed various answers during the long train ride, but none seemed adequate when faced with this man's straightforward manner. "Sometimes a change of circumstance requires a change of location," she said carefully. Jake glanced at her as he secured her trunk in the wagon bed. "Fair enough. We all have our reasons for being where we are." Something in his tone suggested he understood the weight of unspoken stories. Clara climbed onto the wagon seat, grateful when he didn't offer unnecessary assistance. She'd observed that Western men seemed less inclined toward the elaborate courtesies that had suffocated her in Boston society. As they drove through Cedar Ridge's main street, Clara assessed her new home. The town was larger than she'd expected, with a general store, saloon, church, and various other businesses lining the dusty thoroughfare. People moved with purpose rather than leisure, and she noticed several women in practical dresses similar to her own. "Mrs. Henderson runs the boarding house where you'll be staying," Jake explained. "She's also the mayor's wife in the unofficial welcome committee for new residents. You'll find her enthusiastic." "I appreciate any kindness. The position was arranged through correspondence, so I know very little about the community. Cedar Ridge is a good town. Growing, but not too fast. We get cattle drives through in spring and fall, which keeps the merchants happy. Most folks here came from somewhere else, so newcomers aren't viewed with suspicion." They turned onto a tree-lined street where modest houses sat behind white picket fences. Jake stopped the wagon before a 2-story structure with a wraparound porch and flower boxes at every window. "Mrs. Henderson," he called. A plump woman with graying hair emerged, wiping her hands on her apron. Her smile was indeed enthusiastic, as Jake had warned. "Miss Whitmore. Welcome, dear child. I'm Martha Henderson. Come inside. You must be exhausted from that dreadful journey. Jake, bring her things to the blue room upstairs." Clara found herself swept into the boarding house with maternal efficiency. The interior was clean and comfortable, with lace curtains and the scent of fresh bread emanating from the kitchen. "I've prepared a light supper for you," Mrs. Henderson continued, leading Clara to a small dining room. "Tomorrow we'll tour the schoolhouse and introduce you to some of the families. The children are quite excited to meet their new teacher." "How many students will I have?" 18, ranging from 6 to 14 years old. The previous teacher, Miss Johnson, married the banker's son last spring and moved to San Antonio. She did well with the children, though she was perhaps too gentle for some of the older boys. Clara accepted a plate of ham, beans, and cornbread. The food was simple but flavorful, and she realized she was hungrier than she'd thought. "Sheriff Morrison seems quite capable," she ventured. Mrs. Henderson's expression brightened further. "Oh yes, Jake's wonderful. He came to Cedar Ridge about 3 years ago from, well, he's never said exactly where, but he's been the best sheriff we've ever had. Fair but firm, if you understand my meaning. I imagine maintaining order in a frontier town requires both qualities." "Indeed. Though Jake's got a gentle side too. He visits old Mr. Patterson every week to play checkers, and he's never missed reading to the Sunday school children when Pastor Williams is traveling." Clara filed this information away, intrigued despite herself. In Boston, men of authority often wielded power with heavy hands. This sheriff seemed different, though she'd learned to be cautious about first impressions. After supper, Mrs. Henderson showed Clara to her room, a cheerful space with blue curtains and a patchwork quilt. Clara unpacked her few belongings, hanging her 3 dresses in the wardrobe and placing her books on the small desk beneath the window. From her window she could see the main street and the sheriff's office. A light burned in the window, and she wondered if Jake Morrison was still working, or if he lived in the building. In Boston, she'd known the schedules and habits of everyone in her social circle. Here, she was truly starting fresh. The next morning brought her first glimpse of the schoolhouse, a white building with bell tower, and large windows that would provide excellent light for reading. Inside, 18 desks arranged in neat rows faced a teacher's desk and blackboard. Someone had placed wildflowers in a mason jar on her desk, and books were stacked with military precision on the shelves. "The school board meets monthly," Mrs. Henderson explained. "They're all reasonable men who understand the value of education. The mayor, my husband, chairs the board. Sheriff Morrison serves as well, along with the doctor, the bank president, and 2 of the ranchers." Clara nodded, though the information about Jake Morrison's involvement in school governance added another layer to her growing impression of the man. Her first day of teaching proved both challenging and rewarding. The younger children were eager and well-behaved, while the older students tested her authority with subtle defiance. She'd expected this and met their challenges with firm but patient responses, drawing on techniques learned during her brief tenure teaching Sunday school in Boston. During the lunch recess, she stood on the schoolhouse steps watching the children play when a commotion arose from the street. A man on horseback was riding hard toward the sheriff's office, dust billowing behind him. "That's Tom Baker from the Double R Ranch," one of her older students, a boy named Samuel, informed her. "Looks like trouble." Within minutes, Jake Morrison emerged from his office, spoke briefly with the rider, then swung onto his own horse. Clara found herself holding her breath as she watched him ride out of town at a gallop, though she couldn't say why the sight concerned her. The afternoon passed without incident, but Clara's attention was divided between her lessons and glances toward the window. When school ended and the children scattered toward their homes, she remained at her desk, grading arithmetic papers and trying not to think about the sheriff's hasty departure. "Miss Whitmore?" She looked up to find Jake Morrison in her doorway, hat in hand. His clothes were dusty, and she could see lines of fatigue around his eyes. "Sheriff Morrison, I hope everything is well? Cattle rustlers hit the Double R last night. We tracked them to the county line, but they'd crossed into neighboring jurisdiction. Tom Baker lost nearly 50 head. Clara had learned enough about ranching during her train conversations to understand this was a significant loss. "Will you be able to recover them?" Doubtful. These weren't local men, they knew exactly what they were doing and where to cross the boundary. He stepped fully into the classroom, and Clara noticed he moved with economical grace despite his obvious weariness. "I wanted to apologize for missing the school board's informal welcome for you yesterday evening," duty called, as it did today. "No apology necessary. I understand the demands of your position." Jake studied her for a moment, and Clara had the unsettling feeling he could see past her careful composure. How was your first day teaching our local scoundrels? They're good children. Some more spirited than others, but that often indicates intelligence and curiosity. A diplomatic answer. Samuel Patterson and his friends gave you trouble, didn't they? Clara raised an eyebrow. What makes you think that? Because they give everyone trouble. Samuel's father died 2 years ago, and his mother works at the hotel to support them. The boy's got anger he doesn't know how to handle. You seem to know your community well. Part of the job. Also part of living in a small town where everyone's business becomes everyone else's concern, whether they want it or not. There was something in his tone that made Clara wonder about his own story. She set down her pen and gave him her full attention. In Boston, I lived in a community where everyone knew everyone else's affairs, but people pretended otherwise. There's something refreshing about honest acknowledgement of human nature. You didn't enjoy Boston society? The question was asked casually, but Clara sensed genuine interest rather than mere politeness. I found it constraining. There were many rules about what a lady should think, say, and do. I prefer making my own choices. Is that why you came west? To make your own choices? Clara hesitated. She'd been careful to reveal nothing of her circumstances to Mrs. Henderson or anyone else in Cedar Ridge, but something about Jake Morrison's steady presence invited honesty. Partly. I was engaged to a man my parents had chosen. After they died, I realized I had no desire to marry someone I barely knew, let alone cared for. Breaking the engagement caused quite a scandal. So you left. I left. Teaching positions for unmarried women are more readily available in frontier communities than in established cities. Jake nodded slowly. We all have our reasons for being where we are, he repeated his earlier statement. And what are your reasons, Sheriff Morrison? For a moment she thought he might answer. His expression grew thoughtful, almost vulnerable. Then he replaced his hat and stepped back toward the doorway. Perhaps that's a story for another day. Good evening, Miss Whitmore. After he left, Clara remained at her desk, staring at the papers before her without seeing them. Jake Morrison was unlike any man she'd known, direct without being harsh, authoritative without being domineering. In Boston, she'd been surrounded by men who spoke in elaborate courtesies while their eyes calculated her worth as a marriage prospect. This sheriff seemed to see her as a person rather than a commodity. The thought was both refreshing and unsettling. Over the following weeks, Clara settled into Cedar Ridge's rhythms. Her students gradually accepted her authority, though Samuel Patterson remained a challenge. She'd begun keeping him after school for additional tutoring, partly to help with his studies and partly to provide structure for a boy clearly lacking guidance. Jake Morrison appeared frequently around the school, sometimes on official business, sometimes with no apparent purpose except to check on things. Clara found herself looking forward to these encounters, though she tried to convince herself it was merely because he provided adult conversation in a day filled with children's chatter. Miss Whitmore, he said one afternoon in late November, I wanted to discuss Samuel Patterson with you. Clara gestured for him to take a seat in one of the student desks, which he did with some amusement at the incongruity. Samuel's been staying after school regularly. His mother mentioned he's been more settled at home as well. He's a bright boy who needs challenges for his mind and structure for his energy. I've been giving him additional mathematics and having him help organize the library books. Clever. Give him responsibility instead of punishment. Punishment rarely changes behavior, in my experience. It simply teaches people to avoid getting caught. Jake smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his serious features. You have wisdom beyond your years, Miss Whitmore. Experience, perhaps, rather than wisdom. I learned early that my parents' methods of correction were more about their frustration than my improvement. Your parents were strict? They were concerned with appearances and social standing. My behavior reflected on their reputation, so they focused on preventing embarrassment rather than developing character. Clara realized she was sharing more than she'd intended, but Jake's listening manner encouraged confidence. That must have been lonely, he said quietly. It was, though it taught me to rely on my own judgment, which has served me well. Including the judgment to leave Boston and come here? Especially that judgment. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Outside, the November wind rattled the windows, carrying the scent of coming winter. Miss Whitmore, Jake said finally, would you consider joining me for supper tomorrow evening? There's a new restaurant opened above the general store, and I thought you might enjoy a meal you didn't have to prepare yourself." Clara's pulse quickened. In Boston, such an invitation would have been scandalous without proper chaperoning and social protocols. Here, she sensed different rules applied. "I would enjoy that, Sheriff Morrison." "Jake," he corrected. "If we're to share a meal, we should probably use Christian names." "Clara," she replied, surprised by how natural it felt to share this intimacy with him. The next evening, Clara chose her best dress, a deep blue wool with pearl buttons, and arranged her hair more softly than usual. When Jake arrived to escort her, his appreciative glance made her glad she'd taken extra care with her appearance. The restaurant was indeed above the general store, reached by an external staircase. The proprietor, a cheerful woman named Mrs. O'Brien, served beef stew, fresh bread, and apple pie that rivaled anything Clara had eaten in Boston's finest establishments. "Tell me about your life before Cedar Ridge," Clara said as they lingered over coffee. Jake's expression grew guarded, but after a moment he began to speak. "I was born in Missouri, raised on a farm. When the war came, I joined the Union Army, served 4 years, mostly in Tennessee and Georgia. After the war, I tried going back to farming," but he paused, staring into his coffee cup. "But the farm wasn't the same." "Nothing was the same. My parents had died while I was gone. My brother had moved west with his family. The land felt empty, and I felt like a stranger in my own home." Clara recognized the pain in his voice, the particular ache of displacement and loss. "So you became a lawman." "I drifted for a while first. Worked cattle drives, tried mining, even spent a season as a buffalo hunter. But I needed purpose, needed to feel useful. Being a sheriff gives me that." "And you came to Cedar Ridge 3 years ago." "The previous sheriff had been killed in a shootout with bank robbers. The town needed someone, and I needed a place to belong." Clara reached across the table and touched his hand briefly. "I understand that feeling." Jake's eyes met hers, and she saw recognition there, the shared understanding of two people who'd rebuilt their lives from fragments. "What about you, Clara? What did you leave behind in Boston besides an unwanted engagement?" "A house that felt like a museum, friends who weren't really friends, and a life that belonged to someone else's expectations. I loved my parents, but after they died, I realized I'd been living their vision of who I should be rather than discovering who I actually was." "And who are you, Clara Whitmore?" The question caught her off guard with its directness and sincerity. "I'm still discovering that," she admitted. "But I know I'm someone who values honesty over politeness, purpose over comfort, and genuine connection over social convenience. Those are admirable qualities. They're also qualities that made me unsuitable for Boston society. Boston society's loss is Cedar Ridge's gain." The compliment was delivered simply, without flowery elaboration, which made it more meaningful than any of the ornate flattery she'd received from her former suitors. As they walked back to the boarding house, Clara felt a contentment she hadn't experienced in years. Jake's company was easy and natural, without the undercurrent of calculation she'd grown accustomed to in Boston's social interactions. "Clara," Jake said as they reached Mrs. Henderson's front porch, "I'd like to call on you again, if you're agreeable." "I would like that very much." He smiled and tipped his hat. "Good evening, then." Clara watched him walk away, noting the confident set of his shoulders and the measured pace of his stride. Everything about Jake Morrison suggested reliability and strength, qualities she'd learned to value over charm and social graces. Their courtship, if it could be called that, developed slowly over the winter months. Jake would stop by the school regularly, sometimes bringing coffee or offering to walk Clara home. They shared Sunday dinners at the boarding house when Mrs. Henderson invited the sheriff to join them, and occasionally they attended community gatherings together. Clara found herself looking forward to these encounters with an intensity that surprised her. In Boston, courtship had been a formal dance of predetermined steps. With Jake, conversation flowed naturally and silences were comfortable rather than awkward. One February evening, as they sat in Mrs. Henderson's parlor after Sunday dinner, Jake brought up a subject that had been hovering between them. "Clara, there's something I need to tell you about my past." His serious tone made her set aside her needlework and give him full attention. "During the war, I saw things that changed me. Not all of it was honorable, even though it was necessary. I've tried to build a good life here, but I want you to know I'm not the same man who left Missouri 20 years ago." Clara studied his face, seeing the weight of unspecified memories in his eyes. "Jake, we're all shaped by our experiences. The man I know now is honorable, kind, and dedicated to protecting this community. Your past made you who you are, but it doesn't define your worth. Even if some of what I did was questionable. War asks terrible things of good people. The fact that you carry the weight of those decisions shows your character, not the absence of it." Jake looked at her with something approaching wonder. "You continually surprise me, Clara Whitmore." "How so?" "Most women would want pretty reassurances and comfortable lies. You seem to prefer difficult truths. Pretty lies don't build lasting relationships." "And is that what we're building? A lasting relationship?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications and possibilities. "I hope so," Clara said quietly. Jake reached for her hand, holding it gently in both of his. "Clara, I need you to know that I love you. Not the idea of you, not what you represent, but you, your strength, your honesty, your courage in starting over. I love the way you handle the children, the way you see people clearly without judging them harshly." Clara's eyes filled with tears, not of sadness, but of relief and joy. "I love you too, Jake. I never expected to find someone who sees me so clearly and cares for me anyway. Will you marry me?" The proposal was characteristically direct, without elaborate speeches or grand gestures. Clara appreciated its simplicity and sincerity. "Yes," she said, and Jake's smile was brighter than any sunrise she'd ever witnessed. They married in early spring, with half the town in attendance. Miss Henderson wept copiously, claiming she'd known from the first day that they were meant for each other. Clara wore a simple white dress she'd sewn herself, and Jake had gotten a haircut and new suit for the occasion. Pastor Williams performed the ceremony in the church, but the celebration continued at the hotel dining room, where the entire community gathered to wish them well. Clara was touched by the genuine warmth of their neighbors, a stark contrast to the calculated socializing she'd known in Boston. As they danced their first dance as husband and wife, Clara marveled at the journey that had brought her to this moment. "Any regrets?" Jake asked, as though reading her thoughts. "Only that it took me so long to find the courage to leave Boston and find you." "You found the courage when you needed it. That's what matters." "What about you? Any regrets?" Jake considered the question seriously, as he did all things. "I regret the years of wandering, but they led me here. I regret the war and what it took from all of us, but it taught me to value peace and home. I regret that we both had to lose so much before we found each other, but perhaps we needed those experiences to recognize what we have now." Clara smiled up at her husband, this man who'd chosen honesty over easy comfort, just as she had. "Then we're perfectly matched," she said. "Yes," Jake agreed, pulling her closer as they swayed to the music. "We are." As the evening slowed down and they prepared to begin their new life together in the small house Jake had purchased on the edge of town, Clara reflected on the unexpected paths that had led her to this happiness. She'd come west seeking independence and found partnership. She'd left behind a life of social expectations and discovered genuine community. Most importantly, she'd risked everything on the belief that she deserved to choose her own fate. Standing on the porch of their new home, watching the stars emerge in the vast Texas sky, Clara felt the deep satisfaction of a life authentically lived. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, the continuing demands of teaching, the responsibilities of marriage, the ongoing work of building a community in an often harsh land. But she would face those challenges with a partner who saw her clearly and loved her completely. Jake joined her on the porch, slipping his arm around her waist. "What are you thinking about, Mrs. Morrison?" "How strange life is. 6 months ago, I never could have imagined this happiness. And now? Now I can't imagine any other life." Jake kissed the top of her head, and they stood together in comfortable silence, watching the night settle over Cedar Ridge. In the distance, a coyote called to its mate, and Clara smiled at the wild, lonesome sound. She'd found her place in this untamed land, not by taming it, but by embracing its honest challenges and unexpected gifts. Their love story had begun with two people seeking refuge from their pasts. It had become something much more, a partnership built on mutual respect, shared values, and the courage to build something beautiful from the raw materials of second chances. As they finally went inside to begin their married life, Clara carried with her the profound contentment of knowing she was exactly where she belonged, with exactly the right person, having made exactly the right choice and betting everything on love.